The Galactic Council Chamber had stood for 11,000 years, its crystalline spires reaching toward the artificial stars that illuminated the station's massive dome. Representatives from 47 spacefaring civilizations gathered beneath that dome, their translucent pods arranged in concentric circles around the central speaking platform. The air itself hummed with translation frequencies, converting the clicks, whistles, and telepathic pulses of dozens of species into something approximating universal understanding. High Arbiter Vexnal of the Corthan Imperium stood at the center of that platform, his 4 arms folded across his chitinous chest in the traditional pose of supreme authority. His compound eyes reflected the holographic displays floating around him, each one showing fleet movements, territorial boundaries, and the complex web of alliances that had kept galactic peace for 3 millennia. The Corthan had ruled this council since before the last Great War, and Vexnal embodied every bit of that ancient privilege. The matter before us today concerns the newly contacted species designated as humans, Vexnal announced, his mandibles clicking with barely concealed contempt. They have requested admission to the council as a provisional member state. A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled delegates. The Yith representatives' gills fluttered with what might have been laughter. The Medellin Collective's android avatar tilted its head in a gesture of calculated dismissal. Even the normally impassive Vrel seemed to pulse with something approaching humor, their distributed consciousness finding the situation entertaining. Their homeworld, Vexnal continued, is a small rocky planet in an unremarkable system on the galaxy's outer rim. They achieved faster-than-light travel merely 200 of their years ago, a blink of an eye by civilized standards. Their territory encompasses 17 star systems, barely enough to sustain a single sector's infrastructure. They have no significant military presence, no meaningful industrial capacity compared to any established power, and they have contributed nothing to galactic culture, science, or commerce. He paused for effect, allowing his words to settle over the assembly like a verdict already delivered. In short, they are exactly what every newly contacted species is: primitive, weak, and presumptuous. Ambassador Nathan Cole stood in the observation gallery reserved for petitioners, watching the proceedings through reinforced glass that could withstand a plasma strike. He was a tall man in his 50s, his gray hair cropped short in the military fashion he'd never quite abandoned after leaving the Navy. Beside him stood Captain Lisa Martinez, her dark eyes tracking the alien delegates with the careful attention of a predator assessing potential threats. She had served under Cole for 15 years, through 3 border skirmishes and 1 full-scale planetary evacuation, and she knew his moods better than anyone alive. "They're not even pretending to take this seriously," Martinez murmured, her hand resting on the ceremonial sidearm she'd been permitted to carry. "This is a show trial, not a negotiation." Cole nodded slightly. "The Admiral warned us this would happen. Every new species goes through this. They test us, looking for weakness, for submission. It's how they've maintained their hierarchy for millennia. And when they find weakness, that's what the Constellation is for." The Constellation hung in space 3 light minutes from the Council station, surrounded by an escort of 6 destroyers: the Defiance, the Resolute, the Unyielding, the Steadfast, the Indomitable, and the Relentless. Their names had been chosen carefully, each one a message to anyone paying attention. She was humanity's newest dreadnought, her sleek gray hull stretching nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern. Unlike the curved, organic designs favored by most galactic powers, the Constellation was all sharp angles and brutal functionality. Her designers had never tried to make her beautiful. They had tried to make her deadly, and in that they had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Commander Kevin Brooks stood on the bridge, watching the Council station through the main view screen. He was young for his rank, barely 35, but he'd earned his position through a combination of tactical brilliance and an almost preternatural calm under pressure. His crew called him Ice behind his back, and he'd never bothered to discourage the nickname. Better to be feared for coldness than despised for weakness. "Status report," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the hushed bridge. Lieutenant Sandra Kim looked up from her tactical console, her fingers never stopping their constant dance across the holographic interface. She was the best weapons officer in the fleet, recruited personally by Brooks after she'd scored perfect marks in 3 consecutive war games. All systems nominal, Commander. The Corthan fleet is holding position at the outer marker. 17 capital ships, approximately 40 escorts. The Yith have 23 vessels in a blocking formation near the jump point. The Medellin Collective has. She paused, rechecking her readings with a slight frown. Sir, the Collective has 61 ships distributed throughout the system. That's twice what intelligence predicted. Yes, sir. They've been arriving in small groups over the past 12 hours. Our sensors initially classified them as cargo vessels, but their power signatures indicate military-grade reactors. Brooks showed no visible reaction to this news. The Medellin Collective was famously difficult to read. Their hive-mind consciousness made deception almost impossible for them, but it also made their intentions completely opaque until they acted. That they had quietly tripled their military presence suggested they were taking this situation far more seriously than the Council's dismissive attitude implied. Keep tracking them, and make sure the main gun is charged. The main gun. In the official documentation, it was designated the Mark VII Electromagnetic Mass Accelerator. The crew simply called it the Railgun. It ran the entire length of the constellation's spine, a massive electromagnetic tube capable of accelerating a 2-ton projectile to 12% of the speed of light. At that velocity, kinetic energy alone was enough to crack a planet's crust. The physics were simple, almost elegant. Mass times velocity squared, delivering more destructive force than any nuclear weapon in humanity's arsenal. No other species had developed anything like it. They hadn't needed to. The galactic powers had settled their conflicts through elaborate diplomatic rituals, economic pressure, and the occasional small-scale war conducted according to strict rules of engagement. Fleets met in designated areas. Planets were declared off-limits. Civilian casualties were minimized through complex protocols that all parties agreed to follow. Total war was considered barbaric, a relic of primitive ages best forgotten. Humans had a different perspective on warfare. They had learned their lessons in trenches and atomic fires, in genocides and ethnic cleansings, in the kind of absolute conflicts that most galactic species had engineered out of their civilizations millennia ago. They knew what war could be when both sides truly wanted to destroy each other, and they had built their weapons accordingly. Back in the council chamber, High Arbiter Vexnal was concluding his presentation. Additional holographic displays had appeared, showing economic analyses, technological assessments, and military projections, all of them painting humanity as utterly insignificant. Given these factors, I move that the human petition be denied. Furthermore, I propose that their 17 systems be placed under Corthan Protectorate status for their own protection and development. The transition period will be overseen by a joint commission, and full integration into the Imperium is projected to complete within 500 standard years. Ambassador Cole's expression didn't change, but Martinez saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Protectorate status was a polite term for what amounted to economic slavery. Newly contacted species that fell under protectorate arrangements typically remained there for centuries, their resources extracted by their protectors, while they struggled to develop independently. The few that had escaped such arrangements had done so only by demonstrating capabilities that made them too valuable as partners or too dangerous as enemies. The Yith Confederation seconds the motion, came the gurgling voice of Ambassador Threx, his aquatic form rippling in the life support bubble that surrounded his speaking pod. We believe the humans would benefit greatly from Corthan guidance. Their aggressive tendencies, while understandable in a primitive species, require careful management to prevent future disruptions to galactic stability. The Medellin Collective concurs, added the android representative, its voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. We have analyzed the human species extensively and determined that they present no significant threat to galactic stability in their current state. Their technology is primitive by any reasonable standard. Their military capacity is negligible against established powers. Protectorate status is the most efficient outcome for all parties involved. Cole finally spoke, his voice amplified by the translation system that converted his words into 47 different forms of communication. The human delegation requests the right to respond to these proposals. Vexnel's mandibles clicked in irritation. Protocol required that petitioners be granted this right, regardless of how obvious the outcome might be. It was one of the Council's oldest traditions, a nod to the idea that even the weakest species deserve to be heard before being absorbed. The Council recognizes the human representative. You may approach the speaking platform. Cole stepped forward through the access corridor, his movements calm and deliberate. He had practiced this walk 100 times, knowing that every species in the chamber would be analyzing his gait, his posture, his micro-expressions for signs of fear or submission. He gave them nothing. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes or equivalent sensory organs of as many delegates as he could, acknowledging their attention without showing any sign of intimidation. "Honored members of the Council," he began, "I understand your assessment of humanity. By your metrics, we are indeed a young and insignificant species. Our territory is small. Our technology is less advanced than yours. We have achieved nothing that would impress any of you by the standards you have established over millennia of galactic civilization." He paused, and something in his tone shifted, a subtle hardening that even the most sophisticated translation systems struggled to convey. "But I wonder if you've asked yourselves an important question. In the 2 centuries since we achieved interstellar travel, we've encountered your scouts, your merchants, your explorers. You've studied us extensively, our history, our biology, our psychology. You've analyzed our wars, our cultures, our philosophies. You know more about us than we know about ourselves in some ways. So tell me, have any of you wondered why we've made no effort to impress you?" The chamber fell silent. Several delegates exchanged glances, their various forms of communication suddenly muted by uncertainty. Cole continued, his voice steady and measured. "We've seen your wars, your carefully controlled affairs, conducted according to rules that minimize destruction and preserve the existing order. Fleets meet in designated areas, far from civilian populations. Planets are rarely bombarded, and when they are, targets are chosen to minimize casualties. You fight with one hand tied behind your back because you've built a civilization that requires it. Your economies are interdependent. Your cultures have merged and diverged over millennia. You can't afford to truly destroy each other because doing so would destroy yourselves." He gestured toward the viewport, where the stars gleamed cold and distant against the velvet blackness of space. "Humans are different. We evolved on a world where resources were scarce and competition was fierce. We fought wars of annihilation long before we achieved spaceflight. We developed weapons capable of ending our own species, and we came within minutes of using them more than once. We learned, through bitter experience, that there is no war too terrible to fight if the alternative is extinction." Vexnel's voice cut through the silence, laced with condescension and something that might have been the beginning of alarm. "Are you threatening the Council, Ambassador? With what? Your 17 systems? Your handful of ships against our thousands?" "Not a threat," Cole replied, his expression perfectly calm. "A demonstration. I believe that actions speak louder than words, especially to species that have grown accustomed to the empty rhetoric of diplomatic theater." He touched his communicator. "Commander Brooks, you may proceed." On the constellation, Brooks received the signal and felt a small surge of adrenaline that he immediately suppressed. This was the moment they had trained for, planned for, argued about in 100 classified briefings. The moment when humanity would announce its true nature to the galaxy. He turned to his weapons officer, his voice completely level. "Lieutenant Kim, target the decommissioned defense platform at coordinates 447 Mark 12. You may fire when ready." Kim's fingers moved across her console with practiced efficiency. The platform in question was an ancient Corthan battle station, abandoned 3 centuries ago and left to drift in space as a navigational hazard. It was solid duranium and ceramic, designed to withstand sustained bombardment from conventional weapons. The Korthan had used platforms like it to anchor their fleet formations during the last Great War, and they had proven nearly impervious to the energy weapons that dominated galactic warfare. "Main gun charged," Kim reported, her voice professionally calm despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Target acquired. Firing solution confirmed. Firing." The constellation shuddered as the railgun discharged. Deep within the ship's spine, capacitors that had been charging for hours released their energy in a single devastating pulse. A 2-ton slug of depleted uranium screamed down the electromagnetic barrel, accelerating through forces that would have crushed any living thing. It left the muzzle traveling at 36,000 kilometers per second, fast enough to cross the distance between Earth and its moon in 11 seconds, fast enough to outrun most targeting systems, fast enough to carry more kinetic energy than any weapon the galaxy had seen in millennia. The round struck the Korthan platform 3 minutes later. At 12% of light speed, kinetic energy alone approached the yield of a small nuclear weapon. The platform didn't just break apart, it vaporized. One moment it was there, a dark shape against the stars, 3 kilometers of hardened military architecture. The next, there was nothing but an expanding cloud of plasma and debris, a glowing wound in space that marked where the station had been. Every sensor in the system recorded the impact. Every ship, every station, every automated probe captured the moment when a single human projectile erased a structure designed to survive conventional warfare. The data propagated at the speed of light, but the shock spread faster through the sudden silence of communication channels that had been buzzing with confident predictions moments before. In the council chamber, the holographic displays updated in real time, their carefully curated information suddenly replaced by raw sensor feeds showing the destruction. The delegates watched in stunned silence as their instruments confirmed what they had witnessed. The Korthan defense platform, the same class of station that had anchored their fleet formations for 1,000 years, that had survived direct hits from plasma cannons and antimatter torpedoes, simply ceased to exist. Vexnel's compound eyes had gone dark, a sign of extreme stress in his species. His mandibles worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to speak, his voice lacking all the confidence it had carried moments before. That was a single shot." "Yes," Cole confirmed, allowing just a trace of satisfaction to color his words. "The Constellation carries 300 such rounds. Her main gun can fire once every 4 minutes. And she is one of 12 dreadnoughts currently in service, with 6 more under construction and 12 additional hulls on the drawing board." The Yith ambassador's gills were pulsing rapidly, a sign of acute anxiety in his species. His life support bubble seemed to have grown darker, as if his body was trying to hide from what he had just witnessed. "Your weapon, it could strike a planet. You could destroy cities, continents, entire civilizations." "It could," Cole acknowledged, his tone utterly matter-of-fact. "We don't particularly want to. We're not monsters. But we learned long ago that the best way to prevent war is to make its costs unbearable. You've built a civilization based on limited conflict, and that's admirable in its way. But limited conflict only works when both sides agree to the limits. When one side doesn't," he let the implication hang in the air. He turned to face Vexnel directly, meeting the alien's compound gaze without flinching. "If you place our worlds under protectorate status, we will not submit. We will not negotiate. We will not play by your rules. We will fight. And when we fight, we don't fight to negotiate a better position. We fight to win. We will target your industrial centers, your population hubs, your homeworlds. We will use every weapon at our disposal, without restriction, without mercy, without remorse, until one side or the other is completely destroyed." The chamber was utterly silent. Even the translation system seemed to hesitate, struggling to convey the full weight of what had been said. Several delegates had physically recoiled from their displays, as if the words themselves carried the threat of violence. "We don't want war," Cole continued, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its conviction. "We want trade. We want cultural exchange. We want to join your community of worlds as equals, contributing what we can and learning from what you've achieved. We have much to offer, our creativity, our adaptability, our determination, but we will not accept subjugation. Not now, not ever. That is not negotiable." The Medellin Collective's avatar spoke first, its voice carrying a new undertone that might have been respect or fear. "The collective is revising its threat assessment. Based on the demonstrated capabilities of the human weapons system and the stated willingness to employ it without restraint, we calculate that conflict with humanity would result in unacceptable losses regardless of eventual outcome. We withdraw our support for protectorate status and recommend full recognition of human sovereignty." One by one, the other delegates followed, their calculations suddenly yielding very different results. The Yith ambassador stammered something about reconsidering long-held positions in light of new information. Even representatives from minor powers who had never spoken suddenly found reasons to express support for human sovereignty, each one eager to be on the right side of this suddenly shifted balance. Vexnal stood alone, his political support evaporating around him like morning mist under a harsh sun. His compound eyes swept the chamber, searching for allies and finding none. When he finally spoke, his voice was brittle with suppressed rage and something that might have been fear. "The Corthan Imperium recognizes human sovereignty. We withdraw our proposal for protectorate status." Cole inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the concession with the minimum gesture that protocol allowed. "The human delegation appreciates the Council's wisdom. We look forward to productive relationships with all member states." Later, as the delegates dispersed and the chamber emptied of its ancient tensions, Martinez found Cole standing at a viewport in a quiet corridor, watching the stars with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was a hell of a gamble," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "If they'd called our bluff, if they'd decided to attack right then and there." "It wasn't a bluff." Cole's expression was unreadable, but his voice carried absolute certainty. "Every word I said was true. If they'd pushed us, we would have fought, and we would have done exactly what I described, without hesitation and without regret." Martinez studied his profile, trying to reconcile the diplomat she had served with the man who had just threatened genocide. "You really think we could have won against all of them?" "No." The admission came easily, as if it were simply another fact to be acknowledged. "We probably would have lost. The numbers are too stark, their technology too advanced in too many areas. But we would have made them bleed for every system, every planet, every station. We would have turned their orderly civilization into a charnel house. By the time it was over, they would have wished they'd never heard of humanity, and every other species in the galaxy would have seen what happens when you corner us." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never noticed before, a cold calculation that went beyond strategy into something more primal. "That's what they're afraid of now. Not that we could beat them, but that fighting us would cost more than we're worth. It's the same calculation every predator makes before attacking prey that might fight back. The question isn't whether you can win, it's whether the meal is worth the scars. So we're safe. For now. We've bought ourselves time. A generation, maybe two. Long enough to grow stronger, to develop new technologies, to build alliances with species who see us as something other than easy prey." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the satisfaction of a dangerous game played successfully. The galaxy just learned that humans aren't harmless. Now they have to figure out what to do about it. On the Constellation, Commander Brooks received word of the Council's decision and allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. He'd spent his entire career preparing for a war that everyone hoped would never come, and today that preparation had paid off in the best possible way by preventing the war entirely. "Stand down from battle stations," he ordered, his voice carrying across the bridge. "But keep the main gun charged. I want everyone watching to see that we're still ready." Lieutenant Kim acknowledged the order, her hands moving across her console to implement the changes. But she hesitated before speaking again, a question clearly forming in her mind. "Commander, permission to speak freely." "Granted. What happens now? The whole galaxy knows what we can do. Won't they start building their own railguns, developing countermeasures? In a decade, we could be facing the same weapons we just used to scare them. Brooks considered the question carefully, giving it the respect it deserved. Kim was asking about the future of human military doctrine, and she deserved an honest answer. Probably. The Korthan are already analyzing our weapon's signature, trying to figure out how we achieve that velocity without tearing the ship apart. Within a decade, they'll have their own version, maybe better than ours, given their technological base. Then what was the point, if they'll just copy it? The point, Lieutenant, is that we showed them something about humanity that they can't copy with any amount of technology. We showed them that we're willing to build weapons of mass destruction and use them without hesitation. We showed them that we don't accept the comfortable limits they've placed on warfare. We showed them that when we're threatened, we respond with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. He turned to look at her directly. The railgun is just a tool. What they're really afraid of is the species that built it and was willing to use it. The news of the council session spread across the galaxy at the speed of hyperspace communication, propagating through relay stations and courier ships until every civilization with the technology to receive it knew what had happened. The human weapon, the human threat, the human warning. Reactions varied across the spectrum of galactic opinion. The Korthan Imperium officially denounced humanity as dangerous primitives and called for economic sanctions to limit their growth. Privately, their military command began a crash program to develop equivalent weapons, pouring resources into research that had been considered unnecessary for centuries. The Yith Confederation quietly opened diplomatic channels, seeking trade agreements that might give them access to human technology in exchange for technological assistance in other areas. The Medellin Collective simply observed, its vast distributed intelligence processing and analyzing every scrap of data, preparing for a future that had suddenly become much more uncertain. But among the smaller powers, the newly contacted species, and the civilizations that had long chafed under the dominance of the great empires, the response was different. They saw in humanity something they had never dared to imagine, proof that the old order could be challenged. That the rules imposed by the powerful were not immutable laws of nature. That a small, young, supposedly primitive species could stand before the assembled might of the galaxy and refuse to bow. The Vrel Collective, a species of distributed minds that had been under Korthan protection for 5 centuries, sent their first ever direct communication to Earth. The message was simple, an inquiry about the possibility of trade relations, couched in the careful language of diplomatic protocol. But everyone who read it understood what it really meant. The Vrel were looking for alternatives to their current situation. The Scath, a warrior culture that had been forcibly pacified 3,000 years ago, began secretly rebuilding their military traditions. They contacted human military academies, seeking instructors who might help them remember what their ancestors had known before the Korthan had civilized them. The Nth, a race of traders who had learned to survive by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one, started calculating new possibilities. They had always operated within the margins of galactic power, taking advantage of conflicts without ever being strong enough to influence them. But now there was a new player, one that might change the mathematics of interstellar commerce entirely. In a single day, humanity had changed the galaxy's political calculus. Not by conquering territory or amassing wealth or achieving any of the traditional markers of power, but by demonstrating a simple truth. They were willing to fight harder, sacrifice more, and accept costs that other species would consider unthinkable. It was a message that resonated across 1,000 different cultures, in 1,000 different ways. And in the quiet spaces between stars, where ancient intelligences watched and waited, other beings took notice. The galaxy had a new variable in its complex equation of power. How that variable would ultimately be resolved remained to be seen. 3 months after the council session, Ambassador Cole returned to Earth to brief the United Nations Security Council on the results of his mission. He stood before the assembled leaders of humanity, his uniform crisp and his bearing military straight, despite the exhaustion that lined his face, and the gray that had spread through his hair during the long journey home. "We've accomplished our immediate objective," he reported, his voice carrying easily through the historic chamber. "Human sovereignty is recognized by every major power in the galaxy. Our territories are secure from direct military action. No one will be placing us under protectorate status, but I want to be clear about what we've actually achieved and what challenges lie ahead." He activated a holographic display showing the galactic map in stunning detail. Human space was a tiny blue cluster near the rim, almost invisible against the vast expanses of color that represented the major powers. The Corthan Imperium controls over 4,000 star systems. Their economy is 800 times larger than ours. Their military includes 1,500 capital ships and approximately 12,000 escorts, crewed by species that have been fighting interstellar wars for longer than humanity has had writing. If they decided to throw everything they have at us, regardless of cost, they would eventually win. We would hurt them badly, but we would lose. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Cole raised a hand to quiet them. However, they won't do that. The same factors that make them powerful also make them vulnerable. Their economy depends on trade networks that span the galaxy. Their political system requires maintaining the appearance of civilized behavior. A war of extermination against humanity would destabilize their entire civilization even if they won. Too many other species would see it as proof that the Corthan can't be trusted, that no one is safe from their aggression. "So we're safe," said Secretary General Maria Santos, leaning forward in her chair. "We've deterred them." "We've deterred direct military action," Cole corrected, his voice carrying a note of caution. "But there are other ways to fight: economic pressure, political isolation, covert operations. The Corthan won't attack us openly, but they'll work to weaken us, to limit our growth, to ensure we never become a real threat to their dominance. They're playing a long game, and they're very good at it. What do you recommend?" Cole turned to face the full council, meeting each leader's gaze in turn. "We need to build alliances. The galaxy isn't monolithic. There are hundreds of species who chafe under the current order, who would benefit from alternatives to Corthan dominance. We need to find them, support them, create a network of relationships that makes attacking us politically impossible. We need to make ourselves too valuable to destroy and too connected to isolate." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "But we also need to keep building ships, keep developing weapons, keep training soldiers, because deterrence only works if the threat is credible. The moment the Corthan believe they can defeat us without unacceptable losses, they will try. Our job is to make sure that moment never comes." The meeting continued for hours, as humanity's leaders grappled with the new reality their species faced. They were no longer isolated, no longer alone in a vast and indifferent universe. They were part of a galactic community that viewed them with a mixture of fear, contempt, and grudging respect. Their future would be shaped by how well they navigated those complex reactions. When the session finally ended, Cole found himself alone on the observation deck of UN headquarters, watching the lights of New York City spread out below him like a constellation brought to Earth. Captain Martinez joined him there, as she often did when the weight of their mission grew too heavy to bear alone. "You didn't tell them everything," she said quietly, standing beside him at the window. "No." Cole watched an aircraft pass overhead, its running lights blinking steadily against the dark sky. "I didn't tell them about the Medellin Collective's projections. Their analysts have run the numbers 1,000 different ways, and they keep getting the same result. Within 50 years, either humanity will be a major galactic power or will be extinct. There's no middle ground in their calculations, no stable equilibrium where we're just another minor species." Martinez absorbed this in silence, watching the city lights flicker and shift. "What do you think? Are they right?" "I think we've always been good at beating the odds." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that might have been hope or might have been determination. "We survived the Cold War when any rational analysis said we should have destroyed ourselves. We survived the climate crisis when our own planet was trying to kill us. We survived the resource wars when half the world thought the other half needed to die. Every time someone predicted our extinction, we found a way through. That's what humans do. We adapt, we innovate. We refuse to give up even when giving up would be the sensible choice. That's what you're counting on, human stubbornness. Cole smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. It's gotten us this far, hasn't it? From caves to stars in less than 100,000 years. From stone tools to railguns in the blink of a cosmic eye. We're not the smartest species in the galaxy, or the strongest, or the oldest. But we might just be the most stubborn. And sometimes that's enough. 5 years after the council session, the galaxy had changed in ways no one had predicted. Human traders operated in markets that had been closed to them, their goods and services finding niches that older species had overlooked. Human engineers worked alongside alien counterparts on joint projects, bringing fresh perspectives to problems that had been considered solved for millennia. Human diplomats served on committees and commissions throughout the council's vast bureaucracy, their voices small but increasingly difficult to ignore. The Constellation and her sister ships continued their patrols, their railguns charged and ready for a conflict that most hoped would never come. They had never fired in anger since that first demonstration, a fact that some took as evidence of humanity's peaceful intentions, and others saw as proof of their dangerous cunning. Either way, the message remained clear. Humanity would not be easy prey. Commander Brooks, now Admiral Brooks, commanded the First Fleet from the bridge of the newly commissioned Valor. He had overseen the expansion of human military power from 12 dreadnoughts to 36, with each new ship more capable than the last. The railgun technology had been improved, refined, made more accurate and more powerful. New weapons were in development, systems that would make even the current arsenal look primitive by comparison. But he rarely thought about weapons these days. His attention was focused on something more important, the Alliance. The Terran Coalition had started small, just humanity and the Vrel Collective, two species united by their refusal to accept the Galactic Order as it was. But it had grown faster than anyone had anticipated. The Scathi joined, bringing their warrior traditions and their fierce independence. The Nth brought their trade networks and their intelligence operations. Dozens of smaller powers followed, drawn by the promise of protection and the opportunity to chart their own destiny. Now the coalition represented nearly 200 star systems and a dozen spacefaring species. It was still dwarfed by the great empires, but it was growing. More importantly, it was changing the rules of galactic politics. For the first time in millennia, there was a genuine alternative to the established order. The Korthan Imperium watched these developments with growing alarm. High Arbiter Vexnal had been quietly removed from power after the debacle at the council session, his political career destroyed by the humiliation of backing down before a primitive species. But his successors faced the same fundamental problem. Humanity had broken the carefully maintained balance of power, and no one knew how to put it back together. Some argued for war despite the costs. Others counseled patience, hoping that humanity's coalition would collapse under its own internal contradictions. A few, the most far-sighted among them, suggested a different approach entirely: acceptance. Perhaps, proposed Arbiter Kexthal to the Korthan High Council, we have been looking at this situation incorrectly. We see humans as a threat to be contained or eliminated, but what if they are instead an opportunity? His colleagues clicked their mandibles skeptically, their compound eyes dark with doubt. Consider their strengths, Kexthal continued, pressing his argument despite the resistance. They are innovative in ways that our scientists have not been for centuries. They are adaptable, capable of adjusting to new situations faster than any species we have encountered. And they are ruthless when necessary, willing to do what must be done without the hesitation that has come to characterize our civilization. These are qualities we have bred out of ourselves over millennia of comfortable dominance. Perhaps we need them. Perhaps the galaxy needs them, to prevent the stagnation that has been settling over our civilization like a slow death. You propose we welcome them as equals, after they humiliated us before the entire council. I propose we accept reality. They are not going away. Fighting them would cost more than we can afford in both resources and prestige. So perhaps instead of treating them as enemies, we should learn from them, incorporate their strengths into our own civilization. Use them as the engine of change that we cannot provide ourselves. It was a radical proposal, and it would take years to gain acceptance. But the seed had been planted. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humanity's arrival had not been a disruption to be corrected, but a transformation to be embraced. On Earth, Ambassador Cole retired from diplomatic service and returned to his hometown in Vermont. He spent his days tending a small garden and occasionally lecturing at universities about his experiences. Students would ask him about the famous council session, about the railgun shot that had changed everything. His answer was always the same. The railgun got their attention, but it was what came after that really mattered. We showed them that we could be dangerous. Then we showed them that we could be useful. And finally, we showed them that we could be trusted. That's what built the coalition. That's what changed the galaxy. He would pause, looking out the window at the mountains that had watched over his family for generations. The shot was just the beginning. What we've built since then, that's the real achievement. Captain Martinez, now Admiral Martinez, commanded the coalition's combined fleet. She had learned to work alongside alien officers, to understand their tactics and traditions, to build a military force that drew strength from diversity rather than uniformity. The fleet she led was unlike anything the galaxy had seen, a fusion of human aggression and alien sophistication, capable of both the surgical precision of traditional galactic warfare and the total commitment that humans brought to any existential struggle. She often thought about that day on the council station, when a single railgun shot had announced humanity's presence to the galaxy. It seemed so simple in retrospect, a demonstration of power, a threat delivered with precision. But she knew now that it had been much more than that. It had been a declaration of independence, a refusal to accept the limits that others tried to impose, a statement that humanity would chart its own course, regardless of what the established powers thought. That spirit had proven contagious. Other species had seen in humanity's defiance an echo of their own suppressed desires for freedom and self-determination. They had joined the coalition not because humans were the most powerful species in the galaxy. They clearly weren't, but because humans had shown that power wasn't everything. That will and determination and the courage to fight against overwhelming odds could matter just as much. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of that change, not as conquerors or rulers, but as catalysts. They had thrown a stone into the still waters of galactic civilization, and the ripples were still spreading. No one knew where those ripples would ultimately lead. Perhaps to a new order, more dynamic and more just than what had come before. Perhaps to conflict on a scale the galaxy had never imagined. Perhaps to something entirely unexpected, beyond the ability of any species to predict. But whatever happened, one thing was certain. Humanity would face it head-on, with the same determination that had carried them from their single planet to the stars. They had learned to survive in a hostile universe. They had learned to thrive in the face of opposition. And they had learned that sometimes, the best way to make friends was to first make your enemies understand that you were not to be trifled with. The railgun shot had been the announcement. What followed was the conversation. And that conversation was only beginning. 10 years after the council session, the Terran coalition signed its first formal treaty with the Corthan Imperium. It was a limited agreement, focused on trade and scientific exchange, but it represented something unprecedented, the acknowledgement by the galaxy's greatest power that humanity was here to stay. The signing ceremony took place aboard a neutral station, with representatives from over 100 species in attendance. Admiral Brooks commanded the Human Honor Guard, his uniform heavy with the medals he had earned during a decade of careful deterrence. Ambassador Cole, brought out of retirement for the occasion, delivered the human delegation's formal remarks. "When we first came to this council," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled dignitaries, "we were told that we were insignificant, that our technology was primitive, our territory small, our species too young to matter. We were offered protectorate status, subjugation dressed in diplomatic language." He paused, letting the memory settle over the assembly. "We declined that offer. We showed you what we were capable of, and we made clear that we would never accept subjugation. Some of you were afraid. Some of you were angry, and some of you, a precious few, were inspired. His gaze swept the chamber, taking in the diverse array of species that had gathered. Those who were inspired joined us. They saw in our defiance an echo of their own desires for freedom, for self-determination, for the right to shape their own destiny. Together, we built something new. Not an empire, not a hegemony, but a coalition of equals. A place where species work together not because they are forced to, but because they choose to. He turned to face the Korthan delegation, meeting the new High Arbiter's compound gaze without flinching. Today, we take another step forward, not as enemies, not as rivals, but as potential partners. The galaxy is vast enough for all of us. There is room for cooperation, for exchange, for mutual benefit. That is what this treaty represents, not the end of our differences, but the beginning of a new conversation. The treaty was signed. Hands and appendages and tendrils all contributed their marks to the document. And when it was done, the galaxy had changed once more. Not because of a weapon this time, not because of a threat or a demonstration of force, but because enough beings had decided that cooperation was better than conflict, and that the future was worth more than the past. Admiral Martinez watched from the observation gallery, remembering the young captain she had been when this all began. So much had changed. She had changed. The galaxy had changed. And it had all started with a single shot. She smiled, thinking of what Cole had told her all those years ago. The shot was just the beginning. What we've built since then, that's the real achievement. In the years following the council session, humanity developed a reputation that spread far beyond their actual capabilities. Stories circulated through trading posts and diplomatic missions, growing with each retelling. Some said the humans had weapons that could destroy stars. Others claimed they had engineered plagues that could wipe out entire species. The truth was more mundane, but no less effective. Humans were simply willing to do what others wouldn't. This willingness manifested in unexpected ways. When the Vrel Collective faced a border dispute with a minor power, human military advisors suggested tactics that their allies found shocking. Rather than the elaborate ritual maneuvers that typically preceded galactic conflicts, the humans proposed a rapid strike against the enemy's economic infrastructure. The war lasted 3 weeks instead of 3 years, and the Vrel gained more territory than they had held in centuries. "You don't fight to show strength," Admiral Brooks explained to the confused Vrel commanders afterward. "You fight to win. Every day a war continues is a day when your people are dying and your resources are being consumed. End it quickly, end it decisively, and move on." The lesson was not lost on the galaxy's observers. Human military doctrine became a subject of intense study, with academics from every major power analyzing the principles that made it so effective. What they found disturbed them. Humans treated war not as a continuation of politics by other means, but as a catastrophic failure to be avoided at all costs, and prosecuted with maximum violence if avoidance failed. This duality confused species that had grown accustomed to the careful dance of limited warfare. How could a species be simultaneously so eager to avoid conflict and so ruthless in pursuing it? The answer lay in humanity's history, in the atomic weapons and biological agents and environmental disasters that had nearly ended their civilization multiple times. They had learned, through bitter experience, that half measures in warfare led only to prolonged suffering. Lieutenant Sandra Kim, the weapons officer who had fired that famous first shot, rose through the ranks to become one of the coalition's premier tactical minds. She spent years developing new weapons systems and training procedures, always guided by the same principle that had driven the Railgun's development: deterrence through overwhelming capability. "The best weapon," she told her students at the Coalition War College, "is one you never have to use. But if you do have to use it, it should end the fight immediately. Anything less is just prolonging the inevitable." She never forgot the moment when she had fired the railgun at the Korthan platform. The way the ship had shuddered beneath her feet, the way the sensor data had shown the target simply ceasing to exist. She had felt no joy in that moment, only a cold satisfaction that her weapon had performed exactly as designed. That was another thing that distinguished humans from most galactic species. They didn't celebrate war. They prepared for it with obsessive dedication. They fought it with terrible efficiency, and then they moved on. There were no songs of glory, no elaborate victory rituals. War was a job to be done, not an expression of cultural identity. This attitude made humans difficult partners in some ways. They had little patience for the ceremonial aspects of galactic diplomacy, the elaborate rituals that other species use to establish status and precedence. They preferred direct communication, clear agreements, and measurable outcomes. Some found this refreshing. Others found it barbaric. Ambassador Cole had spent much of his career trying to bridge this cultural gap. He had learned to appreciate the subtle nuances of Corthan negotiation, the complex dance of proposal and counter-proposal that could stretch over years or even decades. He had also learned when to cut through all of it and speak plainly. The galaxy has been governed by tradition for so long that most species have forgotten why those traditions exist, he once explained to a group of young diplomats. They follow the forms without understanding the substance. Humans don't have that luxury. We're too new, too impatient, too aware of our own mortality. We need things to work, not just to look right. This pragmatism served humanity well as they built their coalition. Rather than trying to impose a single system on their diverse allies, they created flexible frameworks that allowed each species to contribute according to their strengths. The SciFi provided warriors and security expertise. The Nth handled trade and intelligence. The Vrel contributed their vast computational resources and their unique perspective on distributed decision-making. The result was an organization that was messy, inefficient by traditional standards, and remarkably effective. Problems that would have paralyzed a more hierarchical structure were solved through rapid iteration and experimentation. Failed approaches were quickly abandoned, successful ones rapidly adopted. The coalition learned faster than any comparable organization in galactic history. This adaptability would prove crucial in the challenges that lay ahead. The galaxy was not a static environment, and the balance of power that had been disrupted by humanity's arrival would continue to shift in ways that no one could predict. New threats would emerge, old enemies would seek revenge, and opportunities would appear that demanded quick action. But for now, in the quiet years following the first treaty with the Corthan Imperium, the coalition focused on building. New shipyards rose around human colonies and allied worlds. Trade routes expanded, bringing prosperity to systems that had languished under the old order. Educational exchanges sent young beings of 100 different species to study alongside each other, forming friendships that would shape the galaxy's future. Admiral Martinez often reflected on how far they had come. Standing on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at the stars that humanity had once viewed only from the surface of a single world, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not for power or glory, but for the opportunity to be part of something larger than herself. She remembered a conversation with Cole shortly before his retirement when he had shared his deepest fear, that humanity would become exactly like the empires they had challenged. That power would corrupt them, that success would make them complacent, that they would forget the values that had carried them this far. The hardest thing isn't getting to the top, he had told her. It's staying true to yourself once you're there. Every empire in this galaxy started with noble ideals. They became what they are through the slow accumulation of compromises, each one too small to notice, until one day they looked in the mirror and didn't recognize themselves. Martinez had taken those words to heart. She made it a point to visit the monument at the site of the railgun shot at least once a year, to remember where they had come from and what they had overcome. The spire stood as a reminder not just of humanity's strength, but of their responsibility. They had demanded a place among the stars. Now they had to prove they deserved it. The galaxy was vast and ancient, full of wonders and horrors beyond human imagination. But it was also changing, evolving in ways that it hadn't in millennia, and humanity was at the center of that change. Not as conquerors, but as catalysts. Not as rulers, but as partners. It was a new kind of role for a species that had spent its history either dominating its environment or being dominated by it. Humanity was learning to be something different, a species that could be powerful without being tyrannical, ambitious without being destructive, proud without being arrogant. The lessons were hard and not always learned quickly. There were setbacks and failures, moments when the old impulses toward domination or despair threatened to overwhelm the new ideals. But each time, somehow, they found their way back to the path they had chosen. Because in the end, that was what the railgun shot had really represented. Not just a display of power, but a declaration of intent. Humanity had announced to the galaxy that they would not be victims. But they had also shown in everything that followed that they didn't want to be victimizers either. They wanted to be partners, equals, fellow travelers in the vast journey of existence. And slowly, grudgingly, miraculously, the galaxy was beginning to accept them as such. The future stretched out before them like an unwritten book, full of possibilities both wonderful and terrible. Whatever came, humanity would face it together with their allies, guided by the principles that had brought them this far. Courage in the face of adversity, determination in the pursuit of their goals, and the unwavering belief that the future could be better than the past. He had been right. The railgun had gotten their attention, but it was everything that followed, the alliances, the trade agreements, the cultural exchanges, the slow building of trust across the vastness of space, that had truly changed the galaxy. Humanity had announced itself with a weapon, but it had earned its place with something else entirely, the willingness to grow, to adapt, to build bridges even with those who had once been enemies. That was the real lesson of the railgun shot. Not that violence was the answer, but that sometimes you had to demonstrate your strength before others would take your offers of friendship seriously. That respect had to be earned before cooperation could flourish. That the galaxy was a dangerous place, and only those willing to fight for their survival could hope to thrive. But once that respect was established, once that survival was secured, then the real work could begin. The work of building something better than what had come before. 20 years after the council session, a monument was erected on the spot where the Corthan defense platform had once stood. It was a collaborative effort, designed by artists from a dozen different species and constructed by engineers from across the coalition. The monument took the form of a simple spire, reaching toward the stars, with a single inscription in every known language. Here, humanity made its choice. Here, the galaxy was reminded that the future belongs to those who dare to claim it. The monument drew visitors from across the galaxy, some curious, some reverent, some still struggling to understand what had happened and what it meant. They would float in the shadow of that spire, looking at the empty space where the platform had been, trying to imagine the moment when a single shot had rewritten the rules of galactic civilization. Some saw it as a warning, others saw it as a promise. But all of them understood, on some level, that they were witnessing the legacy of a species that refused to be defined by others' expectations. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy as newcomers, dismissed and underestimated. They had answered that dismissal not with submission, but with defiance. And in doing so, they had proven something that the older species had forgotten, that the universe rewarded those who dared to challenge it. The railgun shot was long since dissipated, its energy scattered across the void. But its echoes would continue to resonate for generations to come, in every treaty signed and every alliance forged, in every ship launched and every world claimed. It was the shot that had announced humanity's presence to the galaxy, and the galaxy would never be the same, because that's what happens when you underestimate humans. You learn, sometimes painfully, that they are exactly as dangerous as they claim to be, and far more adaptable than anyone could have predicted. They take your challenges and turn them into opportunities. They take your limits and break them. They take your expectations and exceed them over and over again until the galaxy itself must bend to accommodate their existence. One shot. That's all it took. One shot to change everything. But then again, humans have always been good at making the first shot count. The end.